the police.
Okay, sorry, I'm just kidding. Or am I? Let's explore. Starting with some context and current events for those of you who maybe aren't in the US or something, or for whatever reason you don't know what has been going on there at the time this video comes out. In my last video, I talked about the global corona pandemic. Now, in the midst of that, the US had the most confirmed cases of infection, per capita and otherwise. In many places, the police started to enforce social distancing to keep people apart from each other. As was touched upon in my last video, this enforcement proved to often be racially biased. As this went on, unemployment in the US grew to about 25%. Rich people got richer, everyone else got poorer, and folks started to get a little bit stir-crazy. Of course, these weren't really new problems, but problems which already existed and were being exacerbated as people were being asked to stay home in order to be safe. But even staying at home wasn't safe for Breonna Taylor and her boyfriend Kenneth Walker. In Kentucky on March 13th, police broke into their home for a so-called no-knock raid, following a drug investigation of other people who did not live in this apartment and were already in police custody. The police were also not in uniform. So, Kenneth, who legally owned a firearm because, of course, it's the US after all, shot at the intruders who were invading his home, not knowing there were actually police in disguise as not police, and the police shot back, and wildly, and Breonna, who was unarmed, was shot 8 times. Kenneth was also injured but survived, and then the Louisville police tried to charge him with assault and attempted murder of a police officer. Now, as happens when police kill unarmed folks with no consequences, a lot of folks got mad about this and they protested, especially in Louisville. The charges against Kenneth got dropped for the time being, and the offending cops were put on administrative leave, but the story still went largely underreported for a long time. But soon after, we did see a rise of protests around the country. It wasn't because police had summarily executed yet another black life, though. It was because angry, often armed, and usually white people wanted to be able to go outside and get haircuts or whatever during the global pandemic. And they were tired of the lockdown, and they wanted to go back to normal life. Meanwhile, there were black protesters in different places too, like in New York, but they were protesting because police enforcement of quarantine procedures was disproportionately and violently being used on black and Latino people, like this cop separating a mother and a child for not social distancing enough.
What happens when systems see black and brown bodies doing the same things sometimes that other communities do? The response is always overzealousness, always overreaction, always excessive force.
But then, on May 25th, cops in Minneapolis killed George Floyd in the streets. He was unarmed, black, and an officer knelt on the back of his neck for 9 minutes while bystanders helplessly begged him to get off and to not kill this man. This time there was footage taken and released publicly, and that footage spread around the internet like wildfire. I'm not going to show it to you here, you can find it for yourself easily enough. Minneapolis took these murderous cops off the force pretty quick, which is better than most times this happens, but it was too little too late. We've seen massive protest movements follow incidents like this before, of course. Not just with the police doing the murdering, but also for a clear bias in the justice system as a whole against black people, especially by white folks in the US. But this time it was different. Maybe it was the divisive nature of Trump's presidency, maybe it was the tanking economic situation and the unrest amid the corona pandemic.
Call it the perfect storm.
Maybe just that many folks had finally seen one too many videos of this thing happening endlessly over and over again, and were suddenly at a breaking point. Of course, it's probably a variable spectrum of all these elements for different people with no singular answer, but the point is that people were sick of seeing black lives publicly lynched by the state for everyone to see, and the sentiment, anger at the callous violence and disregard for black lives at the hands of institutional power, resonated instantly throughout the nation. Once again, people took to the streets to say black lives do matter, at volumes not seen in at least a generation.
Let's open up this can!
Some people protested outside the killer's house. Others burned down the precinct of the killer cops. These people held signs. These people knelt. These people held general assemblies. These people were purportedly hired from a modeling agency to pose with the police. This cop broke some windows. A number of angry protesters set fire to various commercial buildings and police cars. Some people, but never cops, distributed water, food, and medical supplies to the protesters in the streets. Other kinds of people tried to instigate violence between the protesters and the cops in various towns. Their efforts were mostly wasted, though, because these people did instigate violence between the protesters and the cops. A lot of times, in a lot of towns. these people found some bricks. This article didn't talk about those bricks. This asshole tried to put a bomb in the middle of a protest and got his car exploded and his ass beat for his troubles. Some folks redistributed wealth from a Target. The CEO of Target encouraged it. And this guy stole a police horse.
I stole it from the police! I stole the police horse, fuck it!
As protesters surrounded the White House, U.S. President Donald Trump hid in a bunker, then mobilized national military forces against protesters. He came out of hiding with force, having weapons fired at protesters just to take this photo of himself holding a Bible in front of a nearby church. Sorry, I meant this photo. I don't know how I got that mixed up. Soon afterwards, Trump finally built his wall, but it was built around the White House instead of Mexico because, good news, he is actually terrified of the consequences of his own actions. He continues to show this terror by continuously threatening and encouraging an escalation of state and non-state force against protesters. He's shamelessly going full steam ahead on the fascism train, even making a direct claim that being anti-fascist is terrorism. This probably won't end well for him, but it is a very dangerous situation in the US that is likely to get a lot worse before it gets better. Now, police around the country quite literally responded like they were at war, often viciously attacking protesters and street medics and journalists around the country, not to mention people who just happen to be nearby. But why would any police officer do that? Perhaps more importantly, why so many? Well, at least for the police carrying out this violence themselves, which is, again, a lot of them, part of the reason has to be, at least in part, because police feel entitled to use violence on people who aren't police, and also their wives. But why would so many police feel that way? Is it related to their job as police? Are these questions guiding enough? Keeping as close an eye on the unfolding situation as I could, this is about when I first started to see a somewhat familiar pattern of disinformation crop up. For example, in my hometown, Savannah, Georgia, once a major slave port and still a place with institutionalized generational poverty imposed disproportionately on black and brown folks, people who were practicing civil disobedience got this treatment.
Hey! Hey!
Incidents have been happening like this en masse around the country, and often corporate media outlets would report that there was no violence, neglecting to mention that police used weapons against protesters, which is another way of saying that the police were being violent. Other times, the media and police would try to delegitimize people's physical dissent as only being the result of outside agitators.
When Martin Luther King has used us as much as he wants to, then he'll move out.
What about the people who are left behind there now? Are they going to settle down again?
I'm sure that the local people will.
Mm-hmm. You think it's all been due to outsiders?
I think it's definitely been due to outsiders. I noticed yesterday in the march, a group of my friends and I stood there. We were able to count 5 local niggers in the whole march.
Do you think there are many communists in this procession?
I think it's possibly made up of 1/4 communists and 1/2 pro-communists.
An old trick used by police since the civil rights movement, and an often disproven lie meant to pacify the population, to make anger from people seem unreasonable. These institutions will call the first broken storefront window violence, and then call actual physical assault on a person by uniformed militarized force peaceful. These institutions desperately try to convince us that
looting, vandalism
is the problem here, and not police violence against actual human beings.
But you don't see footage of riot police arresting people taking iPads. You see reporters being like, look at the looting! It's happening! For shame! Because the cops don't care about the looting. Allowing vandalism and looting to happen helps shape public opinion against the protest as a whole, leaving them to spend their time having fun with the protesters. Do we have a clip? Oh, we have like 50? Great.
But now it seems like, maybe, hopefully, too many people have woken up to the violence, and how it disproportionately affects some people more than others, and how we're all just too damn complicit if we continue this way in silence. Still, the protests have continued, and still police haven't stopped killing unarmed black folks, or attacking the people who protest about that. And there are a lot of communities that are saying a lot of different things, but one of the biggest things going around right now is defunding the police. Now, that's not actually too radical a concept. It doesn't usually mean getting rid of the police, but it means reforming them into something with less disproportionate power and community funding. Smithers, are they saying to abolish the police? No, sir, nobody's saying to abolish the police. I was saying to abolish the police. The idea of defunding the police has become mainstream enough now that even corporate media heads are starting to talk about it. It makes sense. When you look at studies on the effectiveness of policing versus other forms of crime prevention, or you look at your average US police budgets compared with their respective cities' spending on social services, a clear pattern emerges. The police are over-militarized, overfunded, and overly relied on for social problems. I made an in-depth report about this with some friends on another channel while I lived in Savannah, and it's worth looking at today still around the world, so there'll be a link at the end of this video for anyone who wants to see it. In that video, we focused partially on the primary police strategy of crime deterrence, and how it is provably an ineffective strategy in keeping people safe, which still gets tons of money, while other options aren't properly explored. So this video I want to ask people a question. If police have at least a culture of racism and other violence, and they're not the most effective way to prevent violence, then what is the actual point of giving them so much money if it's not to stop violence? What is the actual point of the police? The answer has actually been established for quite some time by a variety of pedagogues and politicians of many sorts, and even by many cops themselves. It is not a secret and is often stated openly. The role of police as they exist today is to hold a monopoly on violence for the ruling class. More accurately, police hold a monopoly on the legitimization of violence. The police and the so-called justice system they uphold get to decide what violence is okay and what violence isn't okay, what violence gets your life ruined and what violence gets a slap on the wrist, or what violence gets $1 million pension. The violence which isn't protected by the police is anything which disrupts the status quo, and the violence which is protected by the police, even often required of their job, is the violence which maintains the status quo. So, in a society where institutional racism and other forms of institutionalized disparity exist, it is in the nature of people who join the violence institution of this society to violently enforce that disparity. Some people suggest that police can be changed into a non-violent institution. But anything which upholds the disparity of the state through force is ultimately just police by any name, and if it's not doing that, then it's no longer the institution which we right now call police. Class-based society requires force to maintain class disparity, because most people don't actually want homelessness, hunger, poverty, and racism. People are moved to address these things without a profit motive, even in a society where profit motive can literally be the difference between having a house and a meal or being starving and homeless. The enforcement of disparity has existed in many forms throughout civilization's history, but it has also changed a lot along with the forms of oppression which it upholds. The current form of police is specifically the evolution of institutional violence in accordance with the not-quite abolition of slavery. U.S. slavery was made illegal except in prisons, so the police and prison industrial complex were created in ways which specifically maintains the expropriation of free labor from people, and it never stopped being racist. To put it bluntly, police have never existed in a non-violent society, but plenty of non-violent societies have existed without police. So, if we want to get rid of institutionalized violence and disparity, that means that, yes, we need to abolish the police, and whatever takes their place as long as they use force to maintain the status quo. When you talk about good cops, most of the good cops will still arrest and or abuse somebody for taking food they couldn't afford, or for sleeping somewhere they're not allowed to sleep, or for protesting against the status quo. And if a cop wouldn't do those things, they're still knowingly supporting an institution which does. The only good cops quit or get fired, like this woman in Buffalo, who tried to stop her fellow officers from abusing someone and then lost their job and pension.
Gregory Kwiatkowski turned Neil Mack around and started choking him. So then I'm like, Greg, you're choking him, because I thought whatever happened in the house he was still upset about. So when he didn't stop choking him, then I just grabbed his arm from around Neil Mack's neck. He comes up and punches me in the face, and so I had to have my bridge replaced.
Horn says other officers pulled her back when she tried to defend herself. Following that incident, Horn was fired, charged with obstruction for jumping on Officer Kwiatkowski's back and or striking him with her hands. But Officer Kwiatkowski's own words seem to conflict with the charges. In sworn testimony, he says, "She never got on top of me." Nonetheless, Horn lost every appeal, her 19-year career over, and she didn't qualify for a pension. The breadwinner for her 5 children, Horn, now a truck driver to make ends meet. Officer Kwiatkowski retired from the police force after he was suspended for choking another officer on the job, a separate incident of punching another officer when he was off the clock, and most recently, Kwiatkowski and 2 other officers were indicted on civil rights charges for holding down a black teenager and shooting him with a BB gun.
My daughter said, "Mommy, why'd you go to work that day?" She never said, why did you do what you did, or I wish you wouldn't have done it. She just said, I wish you wouldn't have gone to work that day. So, I don't regret it.
And I don't really know what else to say. That's pretty much it. That's the whole video. Abolish the police. Be safe, stay dangerous, and as always, look out for each other. Hey, it would be so awesome if you shared this video with your friends and subscribed to my channel and maybe liked it, and if you comment on the video, that'd probably be pretty cool too. I really want to thank my patrons. It's Capable, and Kaylin, and Albert, and Frank, and Zach. They're super cool and I really appreciate them. Yeah, I think that's it.